The flyer slapped against Mason's face as he stepped onto Craythorn 9. Blood knuckle bash, it read. His freighter was impounded, his funds drained, and the air tasted like rust and regret. Then the synthoid Gorlax 7 loomed in the arena. 7 feet of polished death. Mason fought with nothing but his wits and a prosthetic leg he'd nearly lost before. What happened next would rewrite his entire existence. Mason Verrill stepped into the glare of the arena lights, the titanium prosthetic on his left leg clicking softly against the grated floor. He blinked against the harsh white glow, his hands empty, his mind tracing the same desperate arithmetic that had brought him here. The crowd sound was a low, impatient hum like a machine waiting to be fed. Across the combat zone, Gorlax 7 shifted its weight. The synthoid stood 7 feet tall, polished alloy gleaming under the lights, engineered for one purpose. Its joints hissed faintly as it settled into a low stance, hydraulic pistons tense. Mason read the movement, professional, efficient, lethal. No wasted motion. The bell chimed. Mason didn't move toward the center. Instead, he backed toward the edge of the ring, skirting a loose section of floor plating near a cluster of coolant pipes. The synthoid advanced, its optical sensors tracking him with unnerving precision. Laughter rippled through the stands. They were waiting for the stomp. He remembered the clipping on Betelgeuse III where he'd lost the leg. The feel of hull metal buckling, the long silence afterward. That kind of thing leaves a dent in a person, not just in the body, but there's a peculiar clarity that comes with having very little left to lose. Gorlax lunged. Mason dropped, rolled under the sweep of its arm, and came up behind it. He didn't try to punch metal. Instead, his fingers found the edge of the loose grating, and he hauled it upward, splintering the edge just enough to wedge it into the synthoid's leg joint as it turned. A spark, a grind of protest. The crowd's murmur shifted. He kept moving, using every piece of the arena like it was part of some ramshackle toolkit. A length of loose wiring became a tripline. A discarded hydration canister, flung at just the right moment, disrupted the synthoid's tracking long enough for Mason to kick out a support strut on an overhead light array. It crashed down not on the machine but beside it, a distraction, one more variable in the chaos. The roaring began to build, no longer mocking. They were leaning forward now, caught in the rhythm of something they hadn't expected to see. Not a brawl, but a dismantling. Each time the synthoid recalibrated, Mason was already elsewhere, exploiting hesitation, fault lines in its programming, the tiny lag between decision and action. He saw an opening, a hairline fracture in the synthoid's chest plating, right where a power coupling fed into its core, probably from some previous fight. He feinted left, drew its guard down, then drove the heel of his palm straight into the flaw. Not hard, precise, the synthoid stuttered. Its glowing eyes flickered. A high-pitched whine bled from its vocalizer as systems failed in sequence. Then it dropped, joints locking, and hit the floor with a final hollow clang. Silence held for one breath. Then the arena erupted. Mason stood panting, knuckles bleeding, the crowd's approval washing over him like a physical force. He didn't look at them. His eyes lifted, scanning the private boxes along the upper tiers. There in the shadows of one booth a figure stood watching, tall, slender, utterly still. He couldn't make out the face, only the stillness. An observer who hadn't cheered? The moment held. Then the noise of the crowd faded into the hum of his own pulse. Something had just begun. The crowd's roar hadn't yet faded when Mason noticed her approaching. She moved through the thinning spectators like a blade through water, parting the chaos without effort. Taller than most humans, with the faint silver undertone to her skin that marked her as Vereen, she wore a fitted envoy's uniform, dark gray, unadorned, severe. Her hair was pulled back sharply, emphasizing high cheekbones and eyes that held no warmth, only focus. She stopped a precise 3 paces from him. "Mason Verrill," she said. Her voice was even, a low register that carried without strain. "I am El Ravon, Envoy Class Negotiator 3rd Tier, attached to the Intersystem Diplomatic Corps." Mason wiped blood from his split knuckles onto his pants. "They send diplomats to Bloodsport now?" "I am here on observational assignment," she replied, as if he'd asked about the weather. She didn't smile, didn't frown. Her expression was neutral, a mask of pure analysis. "Your performance was statistically anomalous. I have reviewed your profile. No formal combat training. No military service. Yet you defeated a Class 7 combat synthoid with environmental improvisation and tactical misdirection. Got lucky, Mason said, shifting his weight off his prosthetic. The leg was starting to ache. Luck is not a quantifiable variable, Elra stated. It is an excuse for unobserved causality. She paused, her gaze scanning him like a diagnostic tool. Then she said, perfectly flat, I wish you were my husband. Mason stared. He'd heard things after fights before. Job offers, threats, drunken proposals. This wasn't any of those. There was no hint of affection, no teasing lift in her tone. It was a statement of fact delivered with the cadence of a lab report. Come again? My assessment, she continued, indicates high potential compatibility for a cross-species bonding trial. Your cognitive flexibility, resilience under pressure, and nonlinear problem-solving approach complement my analytical and structured methodologies. The pairing presents a significant opportunity for diplomatic research. Mason blinked. You're saying you want to marry me? For science? Marriage is a loaded cultural term, Elra corrected. I am proposing a formalized bonding experiment, a 12-phase protocol designed to measure interpersonal synergy between human and Vereen subjects. You would be afforded housing, resources, and diplomatic protection for the duration. In return, you participate fully in the trial. He looked around, half expecting to find a hidden camera, some kind of elaborate joke, but her posture didn't waver. She watched him, waiting as if he were an equation she was patiently solving. You've been watching me, he asked, since your arrival on station. Your file was flagged the moment you bypassed 3 separate security protocols to land a ship with expired credentials. Your methods are irregular. They deviate from established patterns. That makes you an object of study. Mason felt the strange weight of it settle over him. This wasn't about fighting. Wasn't about earning credits to get his ship back. She was talking about his entire way of moving through the world. His desperation, his shortcuts, his flaws, as if they were data points. As if he were a specimen, and if I say no, that is your prerogative, she said without judgment. But the offer stands. The benefits are considerable. And the alternative, I suspect, involves continued participation in events such as this. She gestured vaguely toward the stained arena floor. He looked at her. This tall, calm, utterly serious woman who'd just offered him a way out wrapped in a laboratory experiment. His life, which had always felt like a series of accidents and bad decisions, was suddenly being framed as something intentional. Something with purpose, a bonding trial, he repeated, testing the words. Yes, Elra said. It begins with shared activity to establish baseline cooperation. Would you like to review the terms? They sat in a small interview room off the main diplomatic offices. The space was too clean, too quiet. Mason felt like an exhibit. Elra pulled up a holo display between them, the light catching the fine angles of her face. A 12-stage flowchart appeared, each phase marked with a clean geometric icon. It looked less like a relationship and more like a project timeline. The bonding protocol is structured to maximize data collection while minimizing emotional variables, she began. Her fingers traced the air near the projection. Each phase builds upon the last. Deviation is permitted only if documented and justified. Mason leaned forward, squinting at the text. Phase 1, Joint Activity. Cooperative task completion to establish baseline nonverbal communication and division of labor. He looked up. So we build a shelf together? The activity is unimportant, she said. The process is what we measure. Efficiency, conflict resolution, resource allocation. Phase 2 was labeled reciprocal observation. It required them to log each other's behaviors and decision-making patterns for a set period. Mason imagined her taking notes while he drank coffee. He imagined the notes. Subject utilizes caffeine as primary stimulant. Efficiency drops 12% after third unit. It felt less like getting to know someone and more like being audited. Phase 3 introduced vulnerability exchange. The description was clinical, a structured sharing of personal data points considered sensitive within each culture. Mason shifted in his chair. His vulnerabilities included things like the phantom pain in a leg that wasn't there, and the memory of a ship's call sign he couldn't forget. He wondered how that would look in a report. Then came Phase 4, coordinated movement. The protocol suggested partnered physical activity requiring synchronization. Dancing, martial drills, even synchronized maintenance on a vehicle. The goal was to measure kinesthetic empathy and nonverbal cue response. Mason, whose body had always been a tool for survival rather than expression, felt a knot form in his stomach. Phase 5 was simpler and darker, shared conflict. It involved placing the pair in a high-pressure scenario, preferably with an external antagonist, to test cohesion under duress. Mason understood conflict. He'd built a life around it. But doing it for a grade with observers and metrics was a new kind of battlefield. The later phases blurred into a haze of domestic simulations and tactical exercises, shared living quarters analysis, culinary cross-training, even a mock diplomatic incident to be resolved as a unit. Each phase had its own success metrics, its own set of forms to be filed. It was a whole bureaucracy of togetherness. Mason sat back. His whole life had been a series of improvisations, of jumping and figuring out the landing on the way down. This was the opposite. This was a pre-planned route with checkpoints and a manual. "You've got an answer for everything," he said, not quite hiding the disbelief. "The framework eliminates uncertainty," Elra replied. Her eyes were on the chart, analyzing its clean lines. She seemed comforted by its order. But Mason was watching her, not the chart. He saw the way she held her hands perfectly still, the slight tension in her neck. She believed in this system, relied on it. For her, this flowchart was a shield. For him, it felt like a cage. Yet, beneath the clinical terms and the cold logic, something else was happening in the quiet room. A current of simple curiosity. A flicker of something that wasn't in the manual. The gap between the plan and the person was already widening, and they hadn't even started. The Crucible bar wasn't a place you went for quiet conversation. Sound hit you first. A dense wall of alien languages, clinking glass, and the low thrum of a bass unit someone had bolted to the ceiling. The air was thick with the smell of spilled alcohol, ozone from overworked machinery, and something vaguely sulfurous, from a corner where a group of heavily modified patrons were smoking through rebreathers. Mason found a small table wedged between a support pillar and a humming coolant pipe. Elra sat opposite him, her posture so straight she seemed to reject the very concept of slouching. She placed a data slate on the sticky tabletop, its screen glowing with the clean lines of the bonding protocol. It looked absurdly out of place. "This environment presents numerous uncontrolled variables," she noted, her voice cutting through the din without needing to rise. "Acoustics, chemical influences, potential for conflict. It may compromise data integrity for Phase 1. It's called atmosphere," Mason said, signaling a serving droid for 2 drinks. "Might be good for your data. See how we do under fire." The droid deposited 2 glasses. His was a murky amber local brew. Hers was a clear, effervescent liquid the droid identified as hydrated electrolyte solution, neutral pH. She took a small, precise sip. "So," Mason began, leaning forward on his elbows. "Phase 1, joint activity. You want to build that shelf now? I'm handy with a torque wrench when properly motivated." Elra's eyes didn't flicker. "Your use of sarcasm is frequent. A deflection mechanism or a social bonding ritual among your species? It's a personality module. Standard issue. Came pre-installed." He took a long drink. "You guys get anything fun? Or is it all logic and light refreshments?" A fraction of a smile might have touched her lips. It was hard to tell in the shifting light. Farene's social rituals involve shared silence, tactical games, or structured debate. We do not typically employ fermented hydrocarbons. She glanced at his glass. "Maybe you should. Loosen up the protocol a little. Phase 4.5, shared intoxication. We could test the bonding effects of a good buzz." "An interesting proposal," she said, utterly serious. Alcohol's inhibitory effect on the prefrontal cortex could lower social guards, accelerating vulnerability exchange. It would, however, invalidate the data from coordinated movement exercises. She looked at him, and this time the hint of playfulness was clearer. "Your module is functioning at high capacity tonight." He laughed, a short, surprised sound. "See, you can do it." That was almost a joke. "It was an observation of fact," she said, but her tone was lighter. She pushed the data slate slightly aside, a small, almost unconscious dismissal of its rigid order. "Your file indicated a preference for chaotic environments. I am beginning to understand the utility. It forces adaptation." For a while they just talked. He told her about the freighter he'd flown, the kind of places you only land when you have no better options. She spoke about diplomatic conferences, the precise dance of words and implications, a different kind of battlefield. The noise of the bar faded into a backdrop. He wasn't a subject. She wasn't an evaluator. They were just two people at a table finding a rhythm that wasn't on any flowchart. He made another joke about adding a sarcasm calibration sub-phase to her protocol. This time she didn't correct him. She simply nodded a real, genuine nod of consideration. The data would be inconclusive, she said, but the experience might be noteworthy. It was the closest thing to an admission of interest he'd heard from her. The clinical framework was still there, the 12 phases still waiting. But in the humid, noisy dark of the Crucible bar, the first real thread of connection had been spun, and it had nothing to do with the plan. The grand spire rotated slowly, offering a panoramic view of the cityscape below through its transparent alloy walls. Each turn brought a new tableau of glittering lights and moving traffic. On the polished floor of the central atrium, hundreds of diplomats, traders, and officials moved in the precise formal patterns of a Vereen social dance. The music was a complex arrangement of harmonic strings and low-frequency pulses, more mathematics than melody. Mason felt like a wrench in a clockwork mechanism. The suit Elra had provided for him was expertly tailored, but it didn't fit the way he moved. His posture was all wrong. He watched the other couples, their movements synchronized, their steps a language he didn't speak. Elra stood beside him, a statue of calm efficiency. Her own posture was flawless, her presence in the room as natural as breathing. "This is a standard opening movement," she said, her voice low. "We mirror the couple to our left. The steps are deliberate. Watch their foot placement," he tried. He really did. But his body, trained for impact and evasion, not grace, betrayed him. On the third step, his heel caught on the intricate pattern of the floor. He stumbled, catching himself hard on her offered arm. The jolt ran through both of them. A few nearby dancers glanced over, their expressions a mix of curiosity and mild disdain. He felt his face grow warm. "This is a disaster," he muttered. "It is data," she corrected, her grip on his arm firm, steadying. "Kinesthetic miscalibration. We will recalibrate." There was no impatience in her tone. She shifted her stance, guiding his hand to her shoulder, her other hand resting lightly on his waist. "Do not watch your feet. Watch me. Match my breathing. Follow the shift in my weight." It was a different kind of fight, a silent push and pull. He stopped trying to anticipate and started to respond. He felt the minute tensing of her muscles a fraction of a second before she moved. The subtle transfer of balance from one foot to the other. His own movements became less forced, more fluid. He stopped thinking about the steps and started feeling the rhythm she created. The complex music faded into a pulse he could finally follow. The crowd's watching eyes became less important. The rotating view outside the spire blurred. There was only the space between them, the unspoken communication of pressure and release. He wasn't leading. He wasn't following. They were moving together, a single unit finding its balance. She turned her head to look at him, her analytical gaze softening into something else. The clinical distance was gone. "You are not pretending," she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the music. It wasn't an observation for the log. It was a statement of fact, stripped of all protocol. He held her gaze. I am not pretending either," she replied. In that moment, the 12-phase bonding model evaporated. The spreadsheet of compatibility metrics didn't matter. They had found a synchronization that no amount of planning could have engineered. It was trust, built not in a lab but in the awkward, honest space between a stumble and a recovery. The moment held, perfect and fragile. Then the first plasma blast shattered the far window. The elegant music was swallowed by the scream of tearing metal and the terrified shouts of the crowd. The dance was over. The real test had just begun. The trust they'd built on the dance floor was about to be the only thing standing between them and a room full of killers. The first plasma blast ripped through the viewport, not with an explosion, but with a precise, contained crack. A perfectly targeted energy round turned a section of the transparent alloy into a shower of crystalline dust. The elegant music stuttered and died. For a single, suspended second, there was only the hiss of escaping atmosphere and the drifting glitter of broken window. Then the screaming started. The attackers didn't rush in. They materialized, 3 figures in matte black tactical gear, their faces obscured by smooth, featureless helmets. They moved with an unnerving economy of motion, sweeping the room with controlled, overlapping fields of fire. Their weapons were compact, professional. They weren't here for terror. They were here for a list. Mason grabbed Elra's arm, pulling her down behind a overturned serving table just as a volley of plasma seared the air where her head had been. The smell of scorched synthwood and ozone filled his nostrils. "They're not shooting at the crowd," he said, his voice tight. "They're thinning it. Looking for something. For someone." Elra's face was pale but composed. Her diplomatic calm had been replaced by a chilling, operational focus. "Their patterning is military. Marine Special Operations. But the insignia is wrong." She risked a glance over the table. A plasma bolt instantly chewed a molten chunk from the edge. "They are Ascendant Purge." The name meant nothing to Mason. It sounded like a bad drink. "An isolationist faction," she explained, her eyes tracking the attackers' movements, calculating angles. "They believe our species must return to a state of genetic and cultural purity. They call it the Reclamation. They view any interspecies cooperation as contamination." Her gaze met his, and for the first time he saw genuine alarm there. "Mongrel unions. That is their term for bonds like ours. They don't negotiate. They erase." The political abstraction of her bonding trial vanished. This was no longer a clinical exercise in Phase 5. Shared conflict. This was real. Their connection, their very presence together in this room had painted a target on them. The stakes were no longer personal compatibility. They were existential. Around them, the beautiful atrium had become a slaughterhouse. The polished dance floor was slick with debris and something darker. The rotating view of the city was now a fractured mosaic of panic and violence. The elegant dignitaries were just bodies to be moved around. Obstacles in a tactical play. The attackers moved through the chaos with detached surgical precision, their movements a silent language of death. They were checking off targets. And Elra, a diplomat advocating for human-Verine integration, was undoubtedly at the top of their list. Mason felt the old, familiar adrenaline surge, but it was different this time. It wasn't just about his own survival. The need to protect her was a physical pressure in his chest. He looked at the chaos, the professional killers, the shattered remains of their first real moment of connection. The 12-phase model was a joke now. The only test that mattered was this one. Getting out alive, together. The theoretical had just become violently, undeniably real. Their bond was no longer an experiment. It was a declaration of war. The dance floor became a battlefield. Mason grabbed a heavy chair, its ornate metal frame cold under his hands. He didn't swing it like a club. He shoved it, legs first, into the path of the nearest attacker. The assailant stumbled, his shot going wide, plasma searing a black scar into the ceiling. It was a mess. A distraction. Pure chaos. Elra moved the instant the shot missed. Her sidearm was already in her hand. A compact weapon that hummed as it charged. She didn't aim for center mass. She shot the attacker's weapon hand. A precise, calculated burst that made the plasma rifle clatter to the floor. Her movements were economical. Her positioning a series of calculated retreats to maintain clean lines of fire. She was building a defensive grid in her mind, one tactical point at a time. Their styles clashed violently in those first seconds. Mason's improvisation was all noise and movement, creating problems as often as he solved them. Elra's precision required order, a predictable environment to function. He saw her frown as he kicked a table into the path of another purge soldier, sending glass and refreshments flying. Her planned shot was momentarily blocked by the flying debris, but then something shifted. Mason watched her adjust. Instead of waiting for the chaos to settle, she used it. As the second attacker ducked the flying table, his head was exposed for a fraction of a second. Elra's shot took him in the temple. She was starting to calculate for his chaos. He saw it too. Her methodical retreat created a pocket of relative safety, a small zone of control. It gave him a place to work from. He stopped just running. He started creating opportunities for her. He spotted a heavy decorative centerpiece, a twisted sculpture of crystal and wire, and heaved it toward a cluster of attackers. They instinctively scattered, breaking their formation. One turned his back to find the new threat. Elra's shot took him in the spine before he completed the turn. They began to orbit each other, a strange, deadly dance. His creativity opened gaps in the enemy's armor. Her precision exploited them with brutal efficiency. He used a fallen banner to blind an attacker, yanking it taut. Elra put 2 rounds through the fabric into the center of the obscured shape. He created a diversion by smashing a lighting console, plunging a section of the room into flickering shadows. She used the confusion to advance, taking a new, more aggressive firing position she'd previously deemed too exposed. Her planning created structure for his improvisation. She'd identify a weakness, a support pillar that could provide cover, a choke point where the attackers would be forced to cluster. He would then figure out how to drive them into that kill zone, using whatever was at hand, a sonic emitter from a broken console to disorient them, a canister of inert coolant gas to create a smokescreen. It was no longer Mason fighting and Elra fighting. It was them fighting together. A single system with two distinct complementary functions. The Purge operatives were highly trained, but they were trained for symmetrical warfare, for fighting enemies who followed a known playbook. They weren't prepared for this hybrid creature, a mind of pure, calculated strategy paired with a body of relentless, unpredictable adaptation. One by one, the black-clad figures fell, not to overwhelming force, but to a perfectly synchronized mismatch. The clinical framework of their bonding trial was a distant memory. The only data that mattered now was the space between a throne chair and a perfectly placed energy bolt, the unspoken signal to advance, the shared breath before the next move. They had passed Phase 5. They had found their rhythm in the heart of the violence. The trail of the fleeing Purge operatives led them through a derelict service corridor and out into the thin, cold air of a dead moon. The research outpost squatted against the stark horizon, a collection of low, domed structures that looked less like a place of science and more like a bunker. No light showed in the viewports. No communication signals bled into the scanner. It was a ghost station. They entered through a maintenance airlock whose seals gave way with a tired hiss. The air inside was sterile, filtered to the point of tasting like nothing at all. The corridors were wide, lit by the soft blue glow of emergency runners along the floor. Everything was clean. Too clean. There were no scorch marks from tools, no scuffs on the walls from equipment being moved. It was a facility that had been used recently, then scrubbed with professional thoroughness. The main lab confirmed it. It was a vast circular chamber dominated by a central platform, and on that platform sat the device. It wasn't Vine design. It wasn't human. The metal was a strange, non-reflective alloy that seemed to swallow the light. Runes or circuitry, it was hard to tell which, glowed with a soft internal pulse across its surface. It looked ancient and impossibly advanced all at once. A containment chamber. Then he stepped from the shadows. A tall figure, taller than the others, his armor a darker shade of black. The Ascendant Purge insignia picked out in blood red on his shoulder plate. His helmet was a smooth, featureless obsidian oval. He stood between them and the device, a silent sentinel. The air in the room grew heavier. "You are persistent," the figure said. His voice was filtered, metallic, devoid of any identifying tone. "But you are too late to halt the ascension." Mason's hand went to the grip of his weapon. Elra's posture shifted into a ready stance, her analytical gaze fixed on the man. "What is this place?" Mason asked, his voice echoing in the silent chamber. "This is our birthright," the figure intoned. He gestured with one gauntleted hand toward the glowing chamber behind him. "What your alliance calls precursor technology. They fear it. They hide it. They would let us languish in this weakened, diluted state." The disgust in his filtered voice was palpable. "Within that vessel sleeps a genetic echo, a perfect, untouched sample of the first emissary, our original form." Elra's breath caught. "You cannot mean to awaken it. The protocols, the risk is incalculable. The risk is purification," he snapped, the first real emotion cracking through the electronic drone. "Its awakening will send a wave through the Vine genetic lattice, a reset. It will rewrite our physiology, stripping away the weakness, the corruption, the dilution from outside influence." His helmet turned slowly toward Mason. "It will erase your kind's mark on us. We will be whole again. The mongrel unions will crumble to dust." The scale of it crashed down on Mason. This wasn't just a fight. It wasn't even a war. It was an attempt to rewrite the rules of existence. The man wasn't holding a weapon. He was standing guard over a switch that could unmake the entire fragile peace between their species. The bonding trial, their personal connection, was a tiny spark against a coming fire meant to scour the galaxy clean of such things. The confrontation was no longer about stopping a faction. It was about stopping a genesis. The personal had just become planetary. Their bond, an experiment in understanding, was now the only thing standing in the way of a future where such a bond would be genetically impossible. The silent chamber, the humming artifact, the fanatic standing before it. It all framed a single terrifying truth. They were standing at ground zero. The first sign wasn't a sound, but a pressure drop. The air in the lab grew heavy, thick, like diving into deep water. Then the light from the chamber shifted. The soft internal pulse of the precursor device sharpened, intensified, bleeding from blue-white to a deep arterial crimson. The runes on its surface didn't just glow now. They burned. The metal of the containment pod began to audibly groan, a stressed metal shriek that set Mason's teeth on edge. The entity wasn't just awake. It was hungry. Reality in the chamber began to warp. The clean, straight lines of the lab equipment wavered, as if seen through heat haze. A bank of monitors to their left flickered, their screens melting and reforming into swirling non-Euclidean patterns. The floor beneath their feet felt momentarily soft, yielding. Standard military doctrine for containment breach involved suppression fire, tactical retreat, and calling in heavy munitions. None of that applied here. You couldn't shoot a change in the laws of physics. Mason's mind, conditioned for chaos, didn't try to fight the distortion. He started looking for its source. His eyes scanned the chamber, not for a target but for a system. He saw the main power conduit feeding the pod, the backup field generators humming in their recessed alcoves, the data buffer consoles flickering with corrupted readouts. This wasn't a problem for a gun. It was a problem for a mechanic. He realized the only way to contain a thing that rewrote reality was to understand the box it was trying to break out of. Elra! The field generators! He shouted over the rising whine. Can we overload the buffer? Force a containment reset? Elra was already moving, her fingers flying over a nearby console, slapping aside corrupted error messages. The primary field is failing. The entity is feeding on the energy, using it to amplify its own waveform. Her voice was tight, focused, every bit the technical specialist her file promised. An overload could rupture the chamber completely. We need to invert the polarity, create a negative feedback loop. But the systems aren't responding to standard commands. What if we don't command it? Mason said, the idea forming even as he spoke. He pointed to a heavy jury-rigged power relay unit sitting against the wall, a piece of maintenance equipment not part of the main array. We jumped the signal, bypassed the computer, manual override. You tell me which lines to cross, she understood instantly. She began calling out a rapid series of technical commands, a stream of color-coded conduits and frequency calibrations. Mason grabbed the relay unit, yanking cables free from their ports. He worked with a desperate, focused energy, plugging and unplugging heavy-gauge wires based on her instructions. It was the opposite of every protocol. They weren't containing the breach. They were rewiring the prison around the prisoner. Sparks flew from a misaligned connection, stinging his hands. The air grew colder. A voice, not through the air but directly in his mind, calm and ancient, whispered, "There is still time to kneel." He ignored it, his hands moving on pure instinct, trusting her words implicitly. He connected the final cable. For a second, nothing happened. The crimson light intensified, the warping of the room becoming a nauseating swirl. Then the backup field generators flared to life, their hum climbing to a piercing shriek. The light from the chamber didn't explode outward. It collapsed inward, pulling the distorting reality with it like a drain sucking down water. The runes on the device flared one last time, a final silent scream, and then went dark. The entity was gone. Not destroyed. Contained. Trapped within a self-sustaining digital echo, a perfect loop of nothingness woven from its own amplified energy. The sudden silence was deafening. The warped metal of the lab equipment snapped back to its proper shape with loud percussive cracks. The chamber was just a chamber again, dark and inert. They stood there in the quiet, the only sound their ragged breathing and the faint sizzle of overloaded circuits. They had stopped a genesis not with a bomb but with a workaround. The silence after the containment was its own kind of noise. The lab's emergency lights cast long, harsh shadows, making the chamber feel both empty and strangely watched. Mason's hands still tingled from the electrical feedback of their jury-rigged solution. The threat was gone, locked away in a digital echo, but the feeling of it lingered in the air like ozone after a storm. This wasn't a victory. It was a postponement. The entity they had faced defied every category. It wasn't a creature to be fought or a machine to be dismantled. It operated on a level of physics they couldn't map, a set of rules written in a language neither human nor Vereen science could decode. Its threat wasn't about destruction in the conventional sense. It wasn't trying to break things. It was trying to unmake them, to edit the fundamental code of reality itself. The goal wasn't conquest. It was a reset. Mason turned to Elra, his voice low, when it went into the loop, right at the end. He hesitated, searching for the right words for a memory that felt more like a dream. It smiled at me. The statement hung in the cold air. A smile. A simple, almost human expression of recognition, of amusement. It suggested a consciousness behind the power, an intentionality that was far more terrifying than any mindless force of nature. This wasn't a weapon that had been fired. It was a player that had made a move. It had acknowledged him, not as an enemy, but as a temporary obstacle in a much larger game. The entity had personality. It had awareness. And it had, in that final moment, found the entire situation faintly amusing. This changed everything. An opponent you can predict is an opponent you can plan for. This thing was a non-binary, almost mythic presence. It existed outside the simple framework of ally and enemy, good and evil. Its danger was existential. It didn't want to kill them. It wanted to rewrite the universe in such a way that people like them, a human and a Vereen forming a bond, would cease to be a possibility. Their very existence was the error it sought to correct. Their containment solution was a brilliant piece of improvisation, a stopgap woven from desperation and technical skill. But it felt small against the scale of what they were up against. They hadn't defeated the entity. They had tricked it, trapped it in a logical box of its own amplified energy. It was a temporary fix, like plugging a crack in a dam with chewing gum. The pressure was still building on the other side. The entity was still there, waiting, thinking. Their victory was an illusion of safety. This confrontation proved a harsh lesson. Some dangers are too vast, too fundamentally alien, for pure improvisation to overcome. Chaos and cleverness could win a fight in a bar or an arena. They could even win a battle in a lab. But against a force that sought to redefine the nature of life itself, something more was required. They needed understanding. They needed a strategy that went beyond the next 5 minutes. The entity was an elusive, ongoing threat now, a shadow in the system. They had contained the breach, but the infection of its presence remained. The knowledge of it, the memory of that smile, was a chill that wouldn't leave them. They had faced the unknown and learned the most unsettling truth of all. It was looking back. The airlock of the Vine escape pod sealed with a soft hiss, cutting off the sterile, silent dread of the outpost. Inside, the space was compact, efficient, built for survival, not comfort. The walls were lined with smooth consoles and recessed handholds, all illuminated by the soft, dim glow of standby indicators. There were no viewports. The pod was engineered for stealth, its outer shell layered with advanced shielding meant to scatter sensors and hide them from prying eyes. It was a diplomatic lifeboat, designed to get important people out of trouble quietly. It felt like hiding in a well-appointed coffin. Mason sank into the pilot's chair, the synthetic material sighing under his weight. Elra took the station beside him, her movements still precise but lacking their usual crispness. Her fingers danced across the console, initiating the passive drift protocol. The pod detached from the outpost with a gentle thump, leaving them floating in the void. No engines flared. They were a silent, shielded speck against an infinite backdrop, waiting for a rescue signal to be acknowledged. The only sound was the low hum of life support and the sound of their own breathing. The vulnerability was total. If the Ascendant Purge had ships in the area, they were a stationary target. If rescue didn't come, they would slowly asphyxiate in this tiny, perfect box. They knew about the outpost, Elra said, her voice quiet in the confined space. She wasn't looking at him. Her gaze was fixed on a status readout showing nothing but empty space. The Purge operatives. Their positioning, their timing. It was not a raid. It was an extraction. The infiltration within the diplomatic corps and the scientific bureaus runs far deeper than we were briefed. She finally turned her head. The clinical mask was gone, replaced by a weary, grim certainty. This was not an isolated cell. This is an organization with tendrils in places we considered secure. The implications settled over them. They hadn't just stumbled into a fringe group's plot. They had uncovered a systemic rot. Going back to headquarters, filing a standard report, operating within the clear lines of their respective jurisdictions. That was no longer an option. The very institutions meant to protect them could be compromised. So what does that mean for us? Mason asked, though he already knew the answer. It means our operations must now occur outside formal channels, she stated. Unofficial partnerships. Assets without clear affiliations. We will need to operate in the margins, in the morally ambiguous spaces the core avoids. She looked at him, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of something like apology in her eyes. The bonding trial was designed for diplomacy. What comes next will require something else entirely. The pod felt even smaller. The intimacy of the space, just the two of them surrounded by the silent, star-dusted black, was a stark contrast to the galactic scale of the conspiracy they were up against. Their bond, once a clinical experiment, was now their only verifiable asset. It would have to withstand not only external danger, but also the skepticism and potential hostility of their own sides. They were stepping off the map. Mason looked over at her at the sharp line of her profile in the dim light. The woman who had proposed to him with the tone of a lab report. The soldier who had fought beside him with lethal precision. The partner who was now asking him to walk into the gray with her. "All right," he said, his voice flat. "No jokes, no sarcasm. Just a statement. Then that's what we do." She nodded once, a sharp, decisive motion. Together. The word hung in the air between them, a vow made in a vulnerable pod at the edge of nowhere. The 12-phase model was ash. The paperwork was meaningless. The experiment was over. What was left was the raw, unmeasured connection that had been forged in a bar, on a dance floor, and in the heart of a firefight. They were no longer a subject and an observer. They were partners. And the uncertain void ahead was theirs to face together. To understand the men in black armor, you first have to understand their fear. The Ascendant Purge didn't emerge from a desire for power, but from a profound, almost religious terror of contamination. They watched as their civilization opened its doors, forming trade pacts and research alliances with humans and other species. They saw this not as progress, but as a slow, insidious dilution, a loss of self. Their entire ideology is a fortress built around a single core belief. Purity is survival, and any mixing is a form of decay. Their goal is starkly simple, the elimination of all external influence. They want to scrub the vine species clean of any genetic or cultural residue left by contact with outsiders. This isn't just political isolationism. It's a crusade for what they call the reclamation, a return to a mythical, pristine origin state they believe existed before the galaxy got complicated. In their view, they are preservationists, saving their civilization from a terminal illness. Everyone else is a carrier. This worldview places a target directly on any form of interspecies cooperation, but they reserve a special, venomous hatred for bonds like the one forming between Mason and Elra. They have a specific term for such relationships: mongrel unions. The phrase is spat like a curse. It frames a connection built on mutual respect and curiosity as something grotesque, unnatural, a fundamental perversion of the natural order. It reduces people to genetic material and reduces love or partnership to a biological mistake. Their rallying cry encapsulates this chilling philosophy. The ascendancy will rise and the mongrel unions will crumble. It's not just a slogan. It's a promise of a future they are willing to kill to create. A future where the vines stand alone, supreme and unsullied, and where the very concept of a human and a Vereen working together is not just forgotten, but is made genetically impossible. Their methods are a direct reflection of their absolutist goals. They don't protest. They don't lobby. They purge. This involves calculated assassination of key diplomats like Elra, who symbolize the bridge between species. It involves sabotage of joint ventures and the pursuit of dangerous technology, like the precursor artifact which they believe can be weaponized to rewrite vine DNA on a mass scale, editing out any foreign traces. They are surgeons operating on the body of their entire species, and they see any collateral damage as a necessary antiseptic. This ideology is the perfect antithesis of the bonding experiment. Where Mason and Elra's trial is about building understanding through shared experience and observation, the Purge seeks to destroy any understanding before it can begin. Where their framework, however clinical, is designed to measure synergy, the Purge's framework is designed to enforce separation. One is a scaffold for building something new. The other is a wall designed to keep everything out. The conflict, therefore, is never just a simple firefight. Every plasma bolt fired at them is a statement. Every attempt on their lives is an argument. The purge represents a fundamental rejection of the very premise of their existence together. To defeat them, Mason and Elra must prove that a mongrel union isn't a weakness but a new kind of strength. They aren't just fighting for their lives. They are fighting for the right to exist at all. Mason Verrill had spent a lifetime building an identity out of scrap parts and survival. He was the guy who got the job done, the one who slipped through the cracks when things got hot. He was improvisation and instinct, a product of necessity. His self-image was a simple, solid thing, a survivor, not a savior. A mechanic, not a diplomat. Elra Vaughn saw something else entirely. Her analytical perspective landed on him like a scanning beam, and the readout made no sense to him. She didn't see a man barely staying afloat. She saw a unique strategic asset, a source of unpredictable, non-linear solutions, an anomaly. The tension between his view and hers created a quiet friction in his mind. He'd built a life on not being noticed, on being the one who got away. She was noticing everything. He started listening to her observations anyway. He began to see his own actions played back through her clinical lens. That chaotic scramble in the blood knuckle bash wasn't just luck, it was a pattern. A consistent tendency to turn liabilities into tools, to weaponize the environment, to solve for X when no one else could even find the equation. His chaos had a method she was mapping. She valued it. She called it creative inconsistency. He'd never had a name for it before. He'd just called it living. The bonding process forced this self-examination. It wasn't a gentle exploration. It was more like a diagnostic, and Elra's calm, probing questions were the probes. To answer them, to participate in her phases, he had to look at the vulnerabilities he'd spent years ignoring, the phantom ache in a leg that wasn't there, the specific kind of silence that followed a bad decision. He had to acknowledge that his constant, deflective humor wasn't just a personality module, it was a shield. And shields, by definition, hide things worth protecting. His relationship with Elra began to shift under this new light. She was no longer just a problem to be solved, a puzzle of protocols and data points. She was the person holding the scanner, asking the questions he'd never asked himself. Her statement on the dance floor, "I am not pretending," had cracked something open. It was a moment of profound honesty that demanded one in return. He couldn't just joke his way through that. His humor began to change. The sarcasm remained, but it started to reveal glimpses of what it was protecting. The genuine feelings, the quiet acknowledgments of fear and care began to slip through the cracks in the armor. He was still deciding about their relationship, but the process of deciding was the transformation. He was engaging with it, thinking about it, feeling it. The shield was lowering. This personal evolution mirrored the phases of their bonding perfectly. He moved from a reluctant participant, dragged into an experiment he didn't understand, to a committed partner. He began to see the value in the structure she provided, the way her planning created a frame for his chaos. He saw that their strengths weren't just complementary, they were symbiotic. He wasn't just a scrappy survivor anymore. He was half of a unit, a partner. This transformation culminated in instinct, not thought. When the assassin struck at the trade conference, he didn't calculate the risk. There was no strategic assessment. He simply moved, putting his body between Elra and the plasma fire. It was an act he later described as chivalry, calling it outdated and impractical even as he did it. But the action itself was the final confirmation. The survivalist who had spent his life getting out of the way had chosen to stand in the way. For her, the reluctant participant was gone. The committed partner had taken his place. Elra Vaughn presented a facade of pure analytical precision, a living protocol. Her movements were measured, her speech devoid of unnecessary inflection, her entire being calibrated for maximum efficiency. She was a system designed for observation and calculation, a diplomatic instrument. This was the initial data point. But data, as she well knew, could be deceptive. The tension began with a single uncalibrated statement. On the dance floor, amidst the rising chaos, she had looked at Mason and said, "I am not pretending." The words were simple, declarative. They carried no emotional weight in their delivery, yet they detonated the entire premise of their clinical experiment. It was the first crack in the foundation, a glimpse of something operating beneath the programming. That crack revealed a person, Her empathy was not the warm, effusive kind found in human dramas. It was practical, tactical. She understood the utility of connection, the strategic advantage of trust. Her diplomatic training provided the framework, but the will to use it to genuinely attempt understanding came from somewhere deeper. Her ancient, stoic demeanor, which suggested a being set in her ways, actually masked a surprising capacity for adaptation and growth. She had not simply decided to run an experiment on a human. She had chosen to step entirely outside her own cultural programming to do so. That was not the action of a rigid logician. It was the action of a strategist willing to rewrite her own playbook. This evolution became visible in small, significant ways. She began to incorporate human concepts into her analytical framework. Sarcasm, which she had initially logged as a deflection mechanism, became something she could engage with, even reciprocate in her own dry fashion. The chaotic environment of the Crucible bar, which should have been a nightmare of uncontrolled variables, became a dataset she learned to appreciate for its honesty. Her pristine protocols began to show smudges from the real world. Her analytical approach, once absolute, began to soften at the edges through constant exposure to Mason's humanity. She didn't abandon her methods. She integrated his. This complexity made her impossible to categorize. She was a negotiator who could draw a sidearm and engage a squad of assassins with lethal precision. She was a scientist of interpersonal dynamics who could, in a moment of quiet honesty, admit to not pretending. She balanced these facets not as separate roles but as integrated parts of a whole. Her combat readiness was an extension of her diplomacy, a way to ensure the conversation could continue. Her data collection was a way to understand the person fighting beside her. The resolution was not that she became more human. It was that she became more fully Elra. She emerged not as a simple ally or a romantic interest, but as a complex, self-directed individual who had discovered she valued connection. The clinical framework of the bonding trial was the laboratory. What grew inside it was something organic and real. She was a strategist who had calculated the value of a partnership and found it exceeded the sum of its parts. Her final characterization defies simple labels. She is the envoy who fights, the scientist who feels, the ancient being who is still capable of learning. She is not a prize to be won or a tool to be used. She is a partner, forged in the fire of shared crisis. And she is just as committed to the messy, unpredictable experiment as the man beside her. The signal pulsed on the pod's scanner, a clean, repeating beacon of structured authority. Then it filled their narrow viewport. The Alliance dreadnought. It wasn't a ship so much as a moving city of brushed titanium and dark alloy, its lines severe, its scale imposing. Running lights glowed along its flanks like 100 watchful eyes. This was the polar opposite of their silent, shielded pod. This was formal jurisdiction made manifest. A docking vector appeared on their screen, a set of coordinates and a command to hold position. No request, an instruction. The shift was immediate and palpable. Their improvisational existence, forged in blood sport and bar fights, was over. They were now assets to be debriefed. Their actions, no matter how successful, would be weighed against procedure. The dreadnought offered the immense resources of the Alliance: intelligence networks, medical bays, heavy firepower. It also brought constraints, expectations, and a mountain of paperwork. Their chaotic victory now faced official scrutiny. The airlock cycled with a series of heavy mechanical thumps, a sound of finality. The hatch hissed open to reveal a sterile, brightly lit hangar bay. A reception committee stood waiting, 2 officers in crisp uniforms and a diplomatic aide holding a data slate. Their expressions were professionally neutral, but their eyes held the sharp, assessing look of people trained to find flaws in a story before it was even told. The debriefing would be a minefield. They would have to recount the events at the research outpost, the precursor entity, the Ascendant Purge's involvement. They would need to provide official statements, data packet transmissions, and navigate what Mason dryly referred to as the ever-fascinating art of denial of responsibility. Every decision they'd made in the heat of the moment would be picked apart in a quiet room by people who hadn't been there. Their bond, their unorthodox partnership, would be a subject of analysis, a variable in someone else's report. Operating within this formal structure presented a new kind of challenge. Their methods had to be justified. Mason's creative inconsistencies would be labeled as deviations from protocol, Elra's decision to partner with an unknown human would be questioned by her superiors. They would have to learn to speak the language of bureaucracy, to frame their desperate seat-of-the-pants survival as a tactical success. The freedom of the margins was gone, replaced by the weight of the chain of command. Yet, the investigation into the precursor infiltration was vital, and the Dreadnought was the only place it could properly begin. Its labs could analyze the data they'd scraped from the outpost. Its intelligence division could track the Purge's movements. The resources were undeniable. They would just come with a supervisor looking over their shoulder, asking for forms to be filed in triplicate. As they stepped onto the Dreadnought's deck, the clean, recycled air tasted different. It was the air of accountability. The docking clamps locked into place behind them, a final sound that severed them from their brief, chaotic independence. They were back inside the machine. Their partnership, tested by plasma fire and reality warps, would now face its most rigid opponent, red tape. The arrival of the ship didn't end their alliance. It simply moved it to a new, more complicated board. The game was the same. The rules had just changed. Human and Vereen approaches to existence could not have been more different. One prized structure, predictability, and the clean logic of pre-planned outcomes. The other thrived on improvisation, emotional intuition, and finding a way through the cracks. This was the initial seemingly unbridgeable gap between Mason and Elra. Their early interactions were a minefield of cultural misunderstandings. Her clinical observations landed like criticisms. His sarcastic deflection sounded like disrespect. They spoke different languages, not just of words, but of thought itself. Shared danger became their unlikely, brutal translator. There is no faster way to learn a person's language than when your survival depends on understanding their next move. In the chaos of the trade conference attack, they had no time for diplomatic phrasing or careful protocols. They had to adapt, and they had to do it instantly. Miscommunication could mean a plasma bolt to the chest. This immediate high-stakes pressure forced them to find common ground not through discussion, but through action. They learned to read each other's subtle cues, a glance, a shift in stance, the tone of a truncated command. From this forced cooperation, hybrid methods began to form. It wasn't that Mason became structured or Elra became chaotic. They built a third way. Mason's human propensity for humor and improvisation began to infect Elra's analytical process. He'd crack a joke in a tense moment, not to deflect, but to reset the pressure, and she'd learn to use that momentary lapse to recalibrate her aim. She, in turn, shared the Vine perspective on strategic patience and the long-term value of a well-laid plan. He started to see that not every problem needed to be solved with a wrench. Sometimes the answer was in the wiring diagram. This exchange of ideas flowed both ways. Mason introduced concepts like gallows humor as a tool for resilience, the value of a gut feeling alongside cold data. Elra demonstrated the power of silence in negotiation, the strategic advantage of letting an opponent reveal their hand through patience. Their partnership became a live workshop for interspecies communication. They were building a new dialect, one that combined the best of both their worlds. The crucible of Craythorn's bar, with its noisy, uncontrolled environment, became an early testing ground. The formal dance at the Spire was another. Each setting forced a different kind of exchange, a new compromise between chaos and order. The impact of this cultural melding extended far beyond their personal survival. Every time they overcame a challenge using their hybrid approach, they were creating a blueprint. They were proving that a human's flexible thinking and a Vereen's disciplined analysis could create solutions neither could achieve alone. Their success against the Purge assassins, their containment of the precursor entity, these weren't just victories. They were powerful arguments for the value of mixing cultures, of building something new from the combined strengths of different ways of being. Their bond, forged in fire, became a living case study. It demonstrated that the greatest defense against a faction hell-bent on purity was not stronger walls but better bridges. The personal understanding they built through crisis offered a template for a larger, galactic-scale cooperation. It showed that the differences between their species were not weaknesses to be eliminated, but tools to be combined. Their story became about more than two people. It became a demonstration of how the future might work, proving that the most powerful alliances are often found not in similarity, but in complementary difference. What began as a personal experiment conducted in a bar and an arena has reshaped the political landscape of two species. The success of Mason and Elra's bonding trial proved far more than interpersonal compatibility. It delivered a practical, undeniable argument against the fundamental premise of the Ascendant Purge. Their ideology, built on the fear of contamination and the supremacy of purity, cannot withstand the evidence of a team that succeeds because of its differences, not in spite of them. Every time Mason's chaotic ingenuity created an opening for Elra's calculated precision, they weren't just winning a fight. They were winning the argument. This shift moves their story from the personal to the political. Their methods, a hybrid of human improvisation and Vereen structure, offer a new blueprint for diplomacy itself. Traditional negotiations, with their rigid protocols and prescripted outcomes, look clumsy next to the fluid, adaptive partnership they've forged. Future diplomatic teams might be cross-species by design, built on the model they accidentally created, a pairing meant to cover the other's blind spots and think around problems from two angles at once. Their success makes the old way of doing things, with envoys working in parallel but separate lanes, seem obsolete. The scale of the threat they uncovered guarantees this new approach won't be a one-off experiment. The precursor entity represents a danger that transcends any single species' capability to manage. It is a cosmic-level problem that demands a cosmic-level solution, and that can only be built on a foundation of genuine, deep cooperation. The containment wasn't a human victory or a Vereen victory. It was a joint operation that required both of their unique perspectives to succeed. Facing a non-binary reality-altering threat requires a non-binary interspecies response. Their partnership, initially viewed with institutional skepticism, now carries the weight of precedent. Other potential pairings, other bonds that might have been dismissed as unconventional or unwise, now have a case study to point to. A political alliance between their species, once a matter of cautious treaties and trade agreements, could be reinforced by dozens of smaller, personal alliances operating on the front lines. The political map of their galaxy is no longer just about territorial boundaries or resource claims. It's about the strength of the connections between those who inhabit it. The personal has become profoundly political. Their bond, a connection that grew from a clinical proposal on a stained arena floor, is now a transformative force. It challenges a dangerous ideology, proposes a new model for cooperation, and provides the only viable strategy for a threat that endangers everyone. The story of the human with a prosthetic leg and the Vereen envoy is no longer just a romance. It is a template, a proof of concept that the strongest alliances are not forged in similarity, but in the deliberate, difficult, and powerful act of building something entirely new together. The future of their galaxy may well depend on how many others are willing to follow their lead. Mason and Elra's unusual bond forged a new model for interspecies connection, blending human improvisation with Vereen analysis. Their unlikely partnership, born in chaos and tempered by crisis, demonstrates that strength lies in balancing disparate approaches. It challenges rigid ideologies and outdated protocols, offering a viable path through an uncertain future. Their journey proves that unity can become the most powerful strategy, turning cultural divides into tactical advantages. Their success suggests a galaxy where cooperation trumps isolation, and where a little chaos can be exactly what an orderly mind needs.